Good morning, everyone. We are in Mishna Harah, Perek Dalet, chapter 4, Mishna 7, Mishna Zion, Mishna 7. Okay, so the discussion of this Mishnah is revolving around a area near Eretz Yisrael, near Israel, that was called Syria. And the article Mishnah says Syria, a country that was located in what is now the northern part of Syria along the banks of the Euphrates River, was conquered and added to Eretz Yisrael by David HaMelech. He conquered it and added it to the land of Israel. Now, since the conquest of Syria, this conquest of Syria, this was a land outside of the borders of Eretz Yisrael, but since it was conquered, therefore, it didn't receive, or since it was conquered at a certain point of time, it was not considered part of Eretz Yisrael according to Torah law. But rabbinically, the rabbis did give it a status of the land of Israel for certain laws. So our Mishnah is going to revolve around this question about the status of Syria. There's no question that in some ways the rabbis made Syria to be just like the land of Israel itself, but in other ways, possibly not. So let's read. Yisrael sha'ayu arisin lo'ev dekahava b'Syria, a Jew that was a sharecropper. An aris is a sharecropper. A sharecropper means he's not paid a set amount for his work, but rather gets a certain percentage of the crops. So we have a Jew who is a sharecropper, for a non-Jew, Syria in Syria. Now, if this would have been the case of, let's say, the non-Jew owning a piece of land, the land of Israel proper, then the sharecropper would be obligated in separating. And the question, the question here is going to be, let me read. I'm sorry, we'll go a little further. Rabbi Lezer machayev pereisayim b'masr sebeshvius. Rabbi Lezer says obligates these sharecroppers, obligates their fruits in the laws of Maisris and separating Trumas and Maisris, and in the laws of Shemitah, that if it grows during the 7th Shemitah year, that you have to treat it with the sanctity of Shemitah produce. Rabbi Gamliel exempts. Okay, so the question, now we know that when it comes to the obligation of separating Trumas and Maisris from one's produce, that only applies in the land of Israel, doesn't apply outside of the land of Israel. So when it comes to Trumas and Maisris for Syria, if a Jew owns land in Syria and he grows something on that land in Syria, he has to separate Trumas and Maisris. For that, the rabbi said it does have the status of land of Israel. But now the question is, our discussion of the Mishnah is, if a non-Jew owns the land in Syria. If a non-Jew owns a piece of land in the land of Israel, it does have the obligation of Trumas and Maisris. You do have to separate Trumas and Maisris from it. Right. It has the status of, you have to separate Trumas and Maisris, and the produce grown from it has the status of Shemitah produce. That's if a non-Jew owns a piece of land in the land of Israel and you have a Jew that's going to be a sharecropper. Let's say he's getting the produce. He's going to have to separate he's going to have to separate Trumas and Maisris from the produce. And if it grew the year of Shemitah, treat it as Shemitah produce. Our Mishnah's discussion is revolving around Syria in a piece of land owned by a non-Jew. Does that have the status of the land of Israel or not? If it does, which is the opinion of Rebbe Lezer, then the sharecropper has to separate Trumas and Maisris from this land, and if it grew during the Shemitah year, it's got to treat it like Shemitah produce. Rabbi Gamliel paiter. Rabbi Gamliel exempts. That means Gamliel says no. They didn't make Syria like the land of Israel regarding this, since we're talking about a land owned by a non-Jew in Syria, and therefore there will be no obligation of Trumas and Maisris, nor we have to treat it as Shemitah produce if it grows during the 7th year. Now the Mishnah continues into Challah. A discussion about Challah that relates to the same argument. And halacha is the following, which we're going to learn in a future Mishnah, and that is that the obligation to separate Challah outside of Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. It's a rabbinic mitzvah. Rabbis obligated us to do that. Challah, according to Torah law, only applies in the land of Israel. It does not apply outside the land of Israel. The sages said that it does. They enacted that it should be practiced, that it does apply in the outside of the land of Israel. Now, in the outside of the land of Israel, you face a problem. And the problem is that there is another rabbinic decree that lands outside of the land of Israel automatically make you tameh, automatically make you ritually impure. And that's because of the fact that outside of Israel, there were bodies buried in areas that were not designated as cemeteries. We don't know where these bodies were buried. So we don't know anywhere you go, there was the possibility of that you'll be stepping on a grave or over a grave of someone that was buried there. And therefore, since the non-Jews didn't necessarily bury their dead in cemeteries, they just kind of buried them randomly, which means that going over these areas of land would make you tameh, and we really didn't know where these graves were. Therefore, they decreed that just entering into these areas, meaning basically being there, is going to make you tameh because it's like being in a cemetery. Well, if that's so, then when you separate truma, if outside of Eretz Yisrael, it automatically becomes tameh, it automatically becomes impure, which means the Kohen can't eat it, you got to burn it. So essentially, that's what should have happened. What should have happened is that if we have an obligation to separate challah outside of Eretz Yisrael, automatically the challah becomes tameh, and you got to burn it. You can't give it to a Kohen. Sages were concerned, though, that people outside of Eretz Yisrael would forget that essentially challah should be going to the Kohen. And therefore, because that's the law is the challah should be going to the Kohen unless it becomes impure. Happens to be that in Syria, that in outside of Eretz Yisrael, it's automatically becoming impure. Well, that means people forget that there's such a thing as giving challah to a Kohen. Therefore, they instituted that you have to separate two portions of challah. You got to separate one portion as the portion that you anyway have to do, and that is going to be your real challah, just as it's going to become tameh, it's becoming pure. And you can't give it to the Kohen, but they also instituted another separation of challah, and to give it to the Kohen, that people should realize and remember that challah goes to the Kohen. Okay, so now, therefore, if you're in Eretz Yisrael, that's not relevant. This decree of impurity wasn't put upon the land of Israel. The land of Israel, they buried their dead in cemeteries and kept track of everything, and therefore, there was no reason to have to institute that law of impurity in the land of Israel. That means the land of Israel, when you separated challah, you just separated once. Just one challah. Separate it, give it to the Kohen, and make sure it doesn't become tameh. They didn't automatically become tameh. So now the question is, what status does Syria have? Did they treat it like Eretz Yisrael to say that it doesn't, that its airspace doesn't make you tameh? Or did they not treat it like the land of Israel? And therefore, the airspace is tameh. So Rabbi Gamliel says, Shtei chalos b'Surya. In Syria, you have to separate two chalas. Why? Because Rabbi Gamliel says the rabbis didn't treat Syria like Eretz Yisrael in all matters, just like you said before, that they are exempt, that in Syria, the land owned by the non-Jews is exempt from Shemitah and Maasros. So too, in Syria, if you make a dough in Syria, it has nothing to do with non-Jew. You're making a dough in Syria, you got to separate two because it's not like Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Lezer says, no, only one challah. Rabbi Lezer, again, is following his opinion from before, where he said that the sharecropper has to separate Shemitah and Maasros, even though the non-Jew owns the land, because the rabbis treated Syria entirely like the land of Israel. So if so, that means that they did not decree, the decree of impurity, of the airspace becoming impure, was not put on Syria, and therefore one challah is enough. Okay, so these two arguments are really revolving around the same issue. Did the rabbis make Syria completely like the land of Israel or not? So now the Mishnah concludes, Achzu kulei shel Rabbi Gamliel v'kulei shel Rabbi Lezer. People began practicing or grabbed hold of the leniency of Rabbi Gamliel and leniency of Rabbi Lezer. The people in Syria, if there were a sharecropper in Syria, they followed the leniency of Rabbi Gamliel to say no Trumas and Maasros, no Shemitah, and they also only separated one challah. like Rebbe Lezer. That's an inherent contradiction. And therefore, when they were made known of that, when they realized they couldn't do that, when they were told they couldn't do that, they changed to following Rabbi Gamliel in both ways. They followed Rabbi Gamliel to say that it's not like Eretz Yisrael, and therefore Trumas and Maasros and Shemitah don't apply. But now that it's not like Eretz Yisrael, you have to separate two portions of Challah. We are studying the laws of Lashon Harah, Klal Yud, chapter 10 from the Chavetz Chaim. We're in paragraph 15. So the Chavetz Chaim has been talking about how a person, let's say, was victimized by someone in some manner, and he wants to tell other people so that they can help him. And the Chavetz Chaim said you have to make sure that the 7 conditions mentioned before by when you want to tell others about what someone did to someone else, not yourself, have to apply here. And the Chavetz Chaim went through them again to stress its importance, in this case, because you're biased for yourself, and added a little bit more to it also. So now in Tesvav, he continues with this. See, my brothers, how important it is that you really have to weigh things out well. In this kind of situation where you were the victim, you really have to weigh out well how you're going to say this. Because while telling this over, he is in danger, the great danger of speaking Lashon Hara. Unless he's careful with all the conditions mentioned before, ubifrat habeiz v'hadalid. And especially when it came to the second and the fourth. Just to quickly review, the second condition was, right, that you have to really think through and see if he's wronged you. You feel he stole from you. You feel he cheated you. You have to stop and really think, according to the parameters of halacha, did he do so? And the Chavetz Chaim said it's a very hard thing to do because it's, everybody sees things that in to their own benefit. That's number one. So that's the condition you have to be very careful of, because your bias for yourself can have a lot of influence. There are big arguments that happen between people. Both sides are absolutely positive. They're absolutely positive that they're correct, right? And then it doesn't take much to see how biased one side or both sides are about the situation. And therefore, the Chavetz Chaim says that's now. If you're going to tell other people about this, you have to be ready. You've got to weigh this out very well and make sure that you're not being biased about this claim that you're making that he stole from you. You have to seriously think it through. That's number one. The other condition, number 4, was how you have to make sure not to add anything. You have to say the story as is. No exaggerations. No add a little piece of information that aren't true, and then the tip, and the tip of it is the idea of how, even if what you're going to say over about your friend, you're correct, but if there's anything that you can add so that he shouldn't be so degraded in the eyes of people for what he did, even if he's wrong and he has to make amends for what he did. But if you can actually add details that you know of, that would minimize the severity of what he did, meaning minimize people's eyes, that to make it lesser in their eyes what he did wrong. Not that he's not right, not that he's wrong, he's wrong, but you can really be wrong and not as wrong, depending on the circumstances, depending on the situation. There are mitigating factors that could decrease the severity of what he did. Like sometimes he stole, like how could he even do such a thing? And then sometimes he stole because he thinks he's not stealing. Well, he may be wrong and he's got to be corrected, but when people hear it that way, people don't look as bad upon him. If you have those details to do that, you have to do that. Otherwise, from that angle, that you're causing him to be degrading people's eyes more than he should be, from that point, you're speaking Lashon Harah. So he says these two conditions you especially have to weigh very well. This is clearly a situation where our sage has said life and death is in the hands of the tongue. And if he's not going to think to himself, before he starts telling this over, how he should say it. And he's got to plan it out. He's got to figure out in his mind, okay, how am I going to say this? He's got to plan ahead of time how he's going to say it. If he doesn't do so, he's for sure going to stumble. Because as you're saying it over, you start getting a little bit angry, your emotions start building up, and then it's going to be impossible to be careful about these conditions. And therefore, a person has to be very careful to think through, make plans before he speaks. How to say this so as not to make this wrongdoing worse than is. And he has to, again, have intention not to get back at the person, but for a constructive purpose for himself, to be paid back, not to be hurt again. The possibility of just getting it off your chest so that it doesn't bother you. All these things have to be your intention. If your intention is going to be to get back at him, then of course, then it's Lashon Harah and you wouldn't be able to say it. Have a wonderful day.